there's not a lot of young people that are leaving because they're lazy. They're leaving and joining social entrepreneur organizations. They have tons of side hustles. Statistically, like so many of them are building something, creating content online. They're definitely creative and passionate, and there's this energy. It's just not going into kingdom efforts. And so what I think the future church will be is like we are going to have a more robust form of success, of what church success looks like, to where it's in the world. It's one of the big conversations we're trying to think through in culture of Way Church is yes, discipleship, yes, community, and third is.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I hope this next episode helps you thrive in life and leadership. And if you enjoy it, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. That way you'll never miss a thing. Pastors, I know how hard it can be to keep your sermons feeling fresh and relevant, and especially you're preaching week after week. So maybe you hit a writer's block, or it's Friday and you haven't really finished things up. I want to help. So I've got a 10-step preaching cheat sheet. After decades of preaching, I simplified the whole prep process into a series of steps and reminders that can help you ensure your sermons are engaging, relevant, and memorable. Super easy to use. 10 simple prompts with examples, and you can start using it as early as this Sunday. So visit preachingcheatsheet.com or click the link in the description and you'll get a copy sent to you for free today. This episode is also presented by 10 by 10. Did you know that approximately 1 million young people in America drift from their faith every year? And this means that by 2034, 10 million young people will walk away from their faith and miss out on experiencing the abundant life that Jesus promised. Well, imagine if we could do something to reverse this. That's why 10 by 10 was born, a national initiative created to help make faith matter more to 10 million young people over the next 10 years. Together, we can turn the tide of young people walking away from their faith. So the question is, will you answer the call to help 10 by 10 advocate for the faith of the next generation? You can go to 1010.org to learn more. That's 1010.org to learn more. And now to today's episode. Well, it's good to have you both on the podcast.
Hey, Carey. So good to be with you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Carey.
Good to hang out. Like, we're always together in real life, and now we get to actually do this on the podcast, which is good. So I would love to know, you two are married, but before that, you both got really interested in the specific challenges and opportunities that the next generation faces in leadership. So maybe trace out each of your paths on how you got to this place where you're really passionate about the next generation. Who wants to go first?
Why don't you take it?
Okay.
I'll jump off of it.
I mean, I really did get passionate about next gen because, and specifically next gen leaders, because I just was a next gen leader. I was around that time, it was probably about 23 or 24, I got my first opportunity to speak at a conference. And it really was a last second 2-day invite. There was a millennial panel, and this was the prime of, participation trophies was in the conversation, skinny jeans was in the conversation. And I think they realized this a huge conference that Tim Keller was kind of like headlining in Dallas. And they basically realized, hey, we have a millennial panel, but we don't actually have a millennial on the panel.
So a bunch of boomers and Gen Xers talking about millennials? That's always fun.
And I always want to give grace that it was definitely people, and because this happens all the time, there's definitely people that care about the next generation and impact the next generation. But you gotta have someone in the next generation, and it still happens a lot today. I mean, I speak at a lot of different churches, and there's always some younger crowd or a lot of conferences, and there's a younger crowd that comes up afterwards, and they sit together, and afterwards they're like, you know what? At first I was a little skeptical, but you actually represented us pretty well. But I will say, they always say this. They're like, we've been telling them all the same things you said. You just say it better. And they actually try to listen to what you're saying. And so I always tell people, it's like, you got to get them in the conversation. It just does impact it. But long story short is I got in 2 days before they add me to the conversation. I really honestly was going to go in kind of with a heavy hand, because I felt like, man, you guys have 40 speakers. It's so diverse. And I just think what I would feel for the first time, and I'd see going forward, is we always think about diversity and representation at conferences and at events, but it's usually gender and race. We often can go without ever having a 20-something or 30-something, or even maybe a teenager, a Gen Z, like high school kids, sharing just a bit to get a little bit of their perspective. And so I felt like I need to represent. And again, if you remember the millennial days, I really felt like it was pretty negative. It was that participation trophy thing, skinny jeans. It was a lot of more critical. I think it's lightened up with Gen Z, but I had this heart of like, I'm going to go in there and say, you know what, participation trophies, you guys came up with them. We were kids. You could have given us, a Capri Sun, and we wouldn't have known there were trophies. Instead, we were just children, and you guys gave it to us. And then I wish we would have stopped you guys from giving it to us if we knew you were going to hold it over our head. All these things that technically were true, but it just was not the right posture, not the right heart. Honestly, Carey, like the most I've ever felt like a pit in my stomach, like just physical expression of guilt, or just don't do that. So the day before I'm praying, and I just felt like God saying, don't try to convict them into caring for the next generation, like inspire them to, excite them, thank them for, talk about the positive. And so I just talked a lot about the people that impacted me and others. And basically this common denominator I found in the most impactful young people I knew were usually invested in older leaders, they had these people behind them. And I mainly said, we don't have a next gen problem. I think we really have a discipleship problem. And if we could fix that, I think we'll fix whatever's hurting whatever next generation. So that's a long way to say, from there, I started getting asked to speak at all these things. And I figured out, man, it's great to travel and do all this, but it is lonely and it is hard and there's a pressure. And I heard that phrase for the first time, leadership is lonely, which I kind of now, I don't like normalizing that phrase personally. I want to say leadership can be lonely, but you have to refuse to do leadership alone. You have to refuse to do life alone. You have to fight for community, because after college, you never really drift towards community. There's a lot of elements from like high school camp or college fraternities, or you're living in dorms. But after college, like there's not a lot of things that you just drift into community regularly. There's always something going on. You have to, even how many people don't know their neighbors. And so it can be very lonely, but you have to fight for the community. And I just wanted it for myself. And by the grace of God, there was a man named Eric Swanson with, at the time, Leadership Network, who said, he's got a high voice. He's like, Grant, why don't you just do a retreat and get your friends together? And I'm like, all right, I guess. I've just never done a retreat. And he said, just do it. I'll get you a location. I'll cook the food. If you can just get 12 guys together for free, just get them there. As long as they get there, everything else will be free. And that was the beginning of kind of a very soul-giving, like life-giving bond between these guys. And that was 6-7 years ago. What's so cool, Carey, is like Noah Heron was one of the guys. There was 12 guys there. I'd say 8 of those guys are some of my closest friends to this day. And Noah was a photographer at that point. 3 weeks ago, he just planted a church. 500 plus people there here in Nashville. 38 people gave their life to Christ the first day. And I know that we are close and we are healthier now because we all started getting together at a young age and kept fighting for that relationship.
Yeah. Cheyanne, how about you?
Yeah, my journey looked a little different. So I grew up in a really small town in Northeast Texas, about an hour and a half outside of Dallas, a 3-stoplight kind of place. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in church, really faithful, but relatively, in a smaller congregation than, especially compared to the big city of Dallas, right down I-30. And so in my own journey, I love that you use the word inspired, like older leaders feeling inspired and younger leaders inspiring versus trying to convict. First, that's just not our job. It's the job of the Holy Spirit. And so I think that kind of helps keep us in the right place. But I felt really inspired by the people in my life who were calling out leadership traits in me at a very early age. Things that I wasn't even fully kind of seeing in myself or recognizing, knowing that I have a bit of a different wiring. I have a very shepherd, tender heart, can be loud and outspoken, but can also be very soft-spoken at times too. And I just had a number of people, especially in high school and then into college, who kind of just, they said, I see something in you. I want to help cultivate that. And they inspired a lot of that in me, wanting to then do that for others because I had felt like somebody had done it for me. And so when Grant and I met a few years later in college, right outside of college, it was really interesting to see how God had put some things in his heart, the things he was starting to kind of bring to light in my own. And then now being married and doing ministry together has been really interesting to see how those two things that at one point felt a little bit conflicting are very complementary now. And so Grant is just such a visionary at how do I create a structure for a group, for connection to happen? What does that look like from almost even like a systems level? You just have such an eye for that. And for me, I'm very one-on-one. I'm very like, how is your heart? What's going on with you? Let's deep dive into kind of your story. And so it's been really fun to get to do a bit of this work together. And the nature of retreats and gatherings is, you're kind of out away. Ideally, you're in a mountain somewhere and you don't have good cell reception. And so you're kind of unplugged from whatever the kind of normal day-to-day life is. And you're just a little bit more open than you would maybe be. And we've just seen God do a lot in that space that we could never credit to either one of us, but I think he's, in his kindness and goodness, just chosen to partner with us and do things through us that we could never take the credit for.
Well, I want to put a pin in marriage and ministry. So hopefully we can come back to that later on in the conversation. There's a lot of people who are listening who are married and in ministry and trying to figure that out. So we'll come back to it. But I want both of you to talk about the specific challenges and opportunities you're seeing that next gen leaders, and let's just broadly say under 40. And that gets into another pet peeve of mine that, when you're 40, when I was 40, you were kind of seen as a midlife leader. Now you're still seen as young. That's a whole problem that we can get into later on. But when you're looking at under 40 leaders, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What are the struggles? What are the pain points that you are seeing in this new generation of leaders?
Such a big question, Carey.
Yeah, it is.
I'm always going to say that one of the biggest challenges is the lack of discipleship. It's just not a normal thing in our culture, in the church today, to meet Christians who have someone they're discipling. Like, I think if you asked 100 Christians, hey, who is your disciple? Even to ask that they might even kind of laugh at the question. Like, we don't even ask people that. You could actually, even not only Christians, just in leadership, I think you could get a job and go through a whole interview or a series of interviews, and no one ever asks you to get a job at a church. Who's your disciple? I think it should be part of. What do you mean by
that? Who's your disciple? Because discipleship is a big thing, right? So what do you mean by who's your disciple?
Just like, do you have someone? I define discipleship, which I don't think I'm got all the answers on it, but I think we should all have a little clarity on, hey, what does it look like for us? And for me, discipleship looks like the question, is someone frequently following you because you're spiritually a couple steps ahead? And to go a little longer is like, is someone frequently following you and you're helping them become more like Jesus? And I use the language of frequently and following because I think we often confuse what I would call mentorship with discipleship. Like to meet with someone, which is still very powerful. I've had my life changed by meeting with people who have helped me see how to have a healthier marriage, how to be a better leader, how to grow in my intimacy with God. But there's something more robust about like getting to shadow someone. Some of the best leaders of our time definitely shadowed other individuals that were great leaders of their time. And it left them with an idea of like, hey, what would this person do when they were in this situation? And they know because they actually saw them in those situations. I think it's what Jesus did with the disciples, where he leaves and the disciples are like literally asking the question, not just what would Jesus do? What did Jesus do? To me, my favorite sign that they actually didn't just meet with Jesus once a week for 3 years, but they followed him regularly, frequently, is that they were terrible at prayer. Like the whole time they were with Jesus. They literally, he's like, yo, you guys tried to cast these demons out and you didn't know how to do it because you didn't have prayer. Even in the last days, like they're falling asleep while he's praying. Like I think it's also encouraging for any of us that ever pour into young people and don't maybe see the fruit right there immediately, is even Jesus experienced that in a sense that he never really got to see them as prayer warriors. But if you read, let's say you became a new Christian and you just went straight to Acts and then beyond, they're prayer warriors. Like they get beaten and told not to preach the gospel, and they don't pray for a hedge of protection. They pray for more boldness. So like there's this prayerfulness about them that Jesus never really saw, even on his last days, even in suffering. But I like to think, again, maybe some conjecture, but I like to think they would say, hey, we don't have Jesus anymore. But we're in a lot of situations that he was in right now. What did he do? Like, we saw him early in the morning. We had to go find him because he was praying. We saw before the cross and before getting turned over, like he prayed. And so they responded. They started with, they went to the source of prayer and relationship with God. And so I think that to me is discipleship. You're frequently following someone and you're now becoming more like Christ.
So that's interesting. Normally when you talk about next generation, and we've had that conversation dozens and dozens of times on this podcast, you go to anxiety, depression, purposelessness, the list goes on and on and on. Social media, you're almost jumping to the solution side saying the thing that people don't know is, there's a discipleship crisis, not a next gen crisis. Okay, I want to come back to that. What other things do you see your generation, slightly older, slightly younger, struggling with? Cheyanne, what do you see?
Yeah, I think, and this is something else that I think when we have the next gen conversation often comes up and we give credence to. So we all know that it's kind of one of the ingredients stirring around in the melting pot, if you will. But I think the fact that our generation grew up with technology and all of a sudden everyone could have a spotlight. It's definitely kind of grown beyond that. But before then, it would have been like, oh, I published a book and it was really successful, or I started a church and it really began to grow. And you almost kind of earn is the wrong word, but the platform, the spotlight almost grew with you, I would imagine. And I'm sure there are exceptions to that. However, for our generation, you could become well-known and thrust into the spotlight virtually overnight, within a matter of hours.
Without really having done or accomplished anything, grown anything, built anything. Talk about that a little bit more. What's at stake with that? I
think if the light gets shown on our hearts before there's been enough cooking going on, if it's not been in the oven long enough, it can really hurt the recipe. I think it could really do a lot of damage putting something in the spotlight before the internal strength and character and integrity is ready to withstand that and ready to kind of have a really bright light shown on it. I think, unfortunately, that's been so much of a story that we've also grown up seeing in the, in some of the leadership fallout that's just broken all of our hearts. Is I wonder if sometimes because of the digital space, which I'm a huge fan of, I work at a tech company, in fact, I wonder if that has played a role in our platform has grown before our characters had a chance to catch up. And when those two things become increasingly distant from one another, the risk very much increases with it.
I hear you. And, I was just reading, as I'm sure you were just recently, that more kids today want to be influencers than astronauts, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of being a YouTuber or an influencer on TikTok, et cetera. What's the challenge with that? Because I agree. Like, if your platform outpaces your character, the implosion is not a question of whether it's going to happen. It's when it's going to happen.
Yeah. I, on the drive down here to the office, the studio, was thinking about this a bit. And I was really tempted. I didn't because I was driving, but I was really tempted to pull out my phone and check what my screen time was. And I'm not somebody who I am an introvert. I'm a bit introspective as well. And so I'm not a social media guru. I'm probably have a little bit of a pushback against it, just internally for myself, not because I believe it's a bad thing. It's just for my wiring, it doesn't fully fit. But even then, I was like, I can't imagine how much time I actually spend on my phone, on these digital platforms, somewhere within the realm of these spotlights. But how much time am I spending, having conversations with Jesus or wiser, older mentors who have, experienced knowledge and wisdom, where I'm investing the same level, if not more, time in how I'm developing my character and the conversations I'm having with Jesus about what he's seeing, and giving space to the Holy Spirit to do some of that convicting work. And it's a real challenge because I think the world is so good at being up close in our face, and we can very easily turn into a cycle of reacting versus saying like, oh, God gave me a sense of agency and a sense of free will. I wonder what that could look like for me to begin to be intentional about even just where I'm spending my hours, where I'm spending my time, the margin that I'm incorporating in my life for some of those interruptions to happen.
Any other issues that you're hearing about in the DMs or in the text from friends or seeing as you sort of travel the country or build into people? What are some of the other pain points that you're encountering?
Some of the language I've kind of come up with and why I kind of go to discipleship is because it's like so many of the things have failed the next gen that it's kind of like we get to come back to offer something that I think they're really looking for. But language I've used is they've often been coddled by their parents, and then they end up getting criticized by their bosses. They've been crippled by their colleges. Many of them don't get jobs remotely close to what they went to school for. And so coddled by their parents, criticized by their bosses, crippled by their colleges, and then I would even say then confused by the culture. That all these things are making it very difficult for a young leader. And so if you have then parents who are well-meaning, who are like, hey, you got to go to college because this is what it does. And it's like, oh, there's, I would say, a better guarantee of you going into debt than getting a job by going to college. Like it's not separating you like it used to. And I would also say, I would encourage parents we got to stop treating college as like experiences. It must be a training ground to launch them. And sometimes I think college, we've allowed, even as young people, college to become like, it's more about the experience than the education. And so you just are in a lot of debt and you're not further in your role. And so, yeah, I think that those would be 4 areas of the culture's changed. And then lastly, a big one too is another C word, I guess, is my big thing, Carey, I talk a lot about discipleship, but I really care these days, especially among young leaders, is comparison. I think that it is the most subtle, sinister problem in church leadership and just people in general in the next generation, that we kind of treat like a bad habit, instead of treating it as like, no, this is a soul killing, like intimacy stealing. This thing is robbing me of security, identity, intimacy with God. And ultimately, I would say like an authority. I can't walk with an anointing and authority if I'm struggling so much with comparison. But our mentality towards it is the same way we kind of treat biting our nails, in my opinion. Like everyone does it. We all kind of have our thing. And I just think that approach is like killing us, that we're treating it like it's just something to be managed instead of crucified and killed.
I know nobody speaks for their generation, but you do connect with a lot of millennials and Gen Z. Cheyanne, we'll start with you. What would you say is wrong with the church from their perspective or your perspective?
It's a great question.
I'm glad you asked her.
Because Grant's going to rant. Hang on.
No. I'm like, ask her the hard question.
I actually like that phrase, Grant's going to rant. I feel like we should have a t-shirt or something.
Grant rant.
It's interesting. I think in an effort to become more broad, the church has become more niche. I think in an effort to do all and be all, we've actually maybe made it a little bit harder for people to match expectations with their real experience. We've had this conversation a lot being a part of a church plant here in Nashville. And I think a bit of our own journey has been coming to terms with what are our own expectations of what our church should be. What should it be adding to our life? How should we be adding back and serving into it? What is the role of church in our life? When we moved to Nashville a little less than 3 years ago, when we were searching for a new church home, we almost had to come up with a grid in terms of like, okay, how do we even choose a church home? We both grew up in Dallas and had the privilege of being able to go to churches we had really strong relationships with, and all of a sudden we're thrown into this new space. And for us, we had to identify, it's like, okay, well, not everything in the journey with Jesus is dependent on our church. And it challenged a little bit of maybe some of the expectations I didn't even know I had until we started having conscious, like real conversations about it. And so I think my encouragement to the churches would just be, what is Jesus asking you to do in your city? Like what is the part of the body that you've been called to your city? Are you a right hand? Are you a left ear? Are you a knee? Are you an elbow? And then how do you do that to the best of your ability? How do you steward the people who are showing up on Sundays and throughout the week? Like, how are you equipping them to be discipled and to look more like Jesus and to do life the way that he did it?
So Carey, if I actually can pull out something out of her too, because I want to know, but I mean, what would you say were there any kind of, hey, these are marks of a church we don't want to join? And then of course we're helping with a church plan. Like, what is it that we're so emphasizing because we're probably seeing a lack of?
Yeah, that's a good question. We tried not to notice or care as much about the Sunday experience. For us, it was really important to be a part of a church community that was embedded within the community of the city. Like, that was something that was really important for us. So it was like, what is the Monday through Saturday expression of this church, of this local church? Not just the Sunday. That's important. It's not to say one is more than the other. It's more of a both and conversation.
So if I can I want to continue this, but if I just want to clarify a little bit for leaders, particularly church leaders. So what I think I hear you saying, and please correct me, nuance me, whatever. It's like there is a lot of homogeneity in churches. In other words, we're all trying to be Starbucks. We're all trying to, have that same feeling. And again, drop into any city, a lot of even mainline evangelical churches, same songs, same general kind of message, same kind of vibe. And you're saying, no, I want the independent coffee shop that's like all about that neighborhood and all about that city. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is that there's a little bit too much generic in church these days and not enough specific, local, relational?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And I love the analogy of a coffee shop too.
Yeah.
Because when friends come to town and they're asking for a great coffee shop, I'm probably not going to send them to the Starbucks down the road. I'm going to send them to the little hole-in-the-wall places that we know and love because I know the owner and because they have, this special item on the menu that you just have to try.
And you're probably not taking them to Applebee's. Not that there's anything wrong with Applebee's, right? But you're not taking them to Applebee's. You're taking them to some local independent place where you're like, oh, Grant and I love this. This is our favorite spot.
Yeah, they're willing to own their own expression. And also not say like, I have it all figured out. This is the right expression. Sure. Just this is one expression to add to the broader landscape around me. Yeah.
And do you see that in your colleagues, your generation? You see that longing for something a little more unique, a little less generic?
I do. Yeah. I think one thing, especially Gen Z, is really keen on is challenging the status quo. They really value, in a beautiful way, authenticity and individuality. And fortunately for us, that is a lot of what the Bible speaks to as well, in addition to community and the way that we were, wired to be in relationship with others. But I think there is a really unique opportunity for us to kind of tease that out a little bit and get creative. I think It can be really easy, I think, almost to take ourselves a little too seriously sometimes. Not that not to say it doesn't matter or that there isn't weight attached to that and significance, but I think also there's room for fun. And okay, what could a local expression of our church in this city be? What is the city maybe missing that we feel like Jesus may be inviting us into? How can we play a role in that?
That's good. Well, I don't know that we're going to get a Grant rant or not. That's a new concept, about 2 minutes old. But yeah, what would you say from your perspective is, quote, wrong with the church today, Grant?
Yeah, I mean, again, just the discipleship piece missing is definitely something there. I think another one would be, she kind of hinted at it, as we are helping with that Way Church with Noah here in Nashville. And our technical roles or titles, at least, as director of culture. It's basically, hey, we kind of told them we're gonna be your best members that aren't on staff. So I feel like that's great. Is we want to help a lot. We don't want to be on staff, but we do want to help like a lot with, especially building a culture that resonates with what we see missing in the church, maybe, and young people are desiring. And I feel like probably number one is what we're really focusing on. In Nashville, it's probably the best place to expose the heart of this too, is community is probably what we're thinking people want the most. Even Carey, we're doing a conference this year called the Next Gen Summit. And so I'm talking to all these different churches that are coming, and there's definitely a conference fatigue in the world today. And there's something I keep saying, which is not just like a line I'm using. I do retreats and done private gatherings for 7 years. And my scorecard is always connection first, content second. Like, just because in my opinion, the next generation is saturated with content. Like, I don't know a lot of people like, I'm looking for more content. They're literally unsubscribing from so much content. We can't even keep up with how many different channels we can get content from. Like all the different ways to watch movies or watch TV. It used to be like, I jokingly would say, like, it used to be Seinfeld or Friends. And now it's so many, not just good shows, amazing shows. We don't have enough time to watch all the content. And so connection, though, is so much loneliness and so much, even depression, I think, comes from loneliness, and just so much desire to, what the language I use is like, not to be in a forced community, which sometimes small groups can become that, where we found ourselves, we're kind of outing ourselves on this, is we never share this in a public setting, but I've also never been interviewed with my wife like this.
Really?
So I love that I'm doing it with you. Yeah, I'm not like this, not on a podcast, not to my knowledge. And so basically, one of the things we found is we would be in small groups, and I get it's hard, especially at large churches, where you got to just put people in groups. Like, very hard to get into the nitty gritty of how do we connect all these people into the right groups. But you can usually tell, just like on a blind date, like within 10 minutes, especially a night, hey, this is not it.
Not gonna work.
Or man, hey, there's a chance here. Like, I could see that. And we always are surprised. Sometimes we have the wrong intuition of where that relationship's going to go, but by and large, you can usually tell. And I always say to young people, especially in our staff, or when we're trying to talk through this, is like, I never want our small groups to feel like situations where I would be in, where we're hanging out with our friends, and they were like, oh my gosh, it's Thursday night, guys, I gotta go to this thing. And they're like, what is it? It's like, it's my community, I guess. But I don't know. I never see them except for this one time of the week, and we literally never try to hang out outside of this, and they barely know me still, but we always just talk about stuff, but we don't talk about our lives. And that's, again, we all are trying to navigate how to build relationship at a mass scale. But all that to say is I just think community, and here in Nashville, when I say it exposes that, is it's crazy, Carey, is like, when we started doing these interest meetings for Way Church, I started, the second time we did it, we asked like, hey, how many of you guys moved here in the last 2 years? And it was legit like 70% of the group. I would still say, as now we're months into, from interest meetings to gathering, my number one question when I'm meeting a new person, which is probably about 30, 40 a week right now, that are coming to the church, is, hey, how long have you lived here? And it's usually, I mean, how many times I get 2 months or less? It's just so many new people. And so, again, highlighting Eric Swanson again for just mentoring me and discipling me, he would always say this line, where he said people are the most susceptible to the gospel in transition more than instability. And he kind of talked about, like, just even think about your own testimony. I bet there was some big shift or change within 3 months of you giving your life to Christ. And people are just more open. And well, if you invite someone to church and they've lived there for 15 years or even 7 years or 5 years, and you're like, hey, you should come to this or a small group or this thing our church is doing. They're like, oh, we already got our rhythms, our things. This is what we do Tuesday nights. This is what we do Thursday nights. But if they're new to the city, they're 6 months in, especially 2 months in, it's like, we found so many people. How many people I've invited to play spike ball for the kingdom? Like, it's so easy. People be giving their number immediately. Like, when they want to hang out, they're looking for their community and their rhythms. And so I just think for right now, in a saturated content world, giving connection, deep connection, sincere connection, the people who I do life with and I partner with and I build things with, who can just call me. They don't have to say, hey, can I set up a meeting? They just call. Are people I've had bonding late night experiences with, where we hang out, we've done things. It's like I'm always thinking, how can I create core memories among these people? Because if I've had core memories with them, then when things get hard or when I see you're messing up, I'm just going to call. I know we had a connection. I know that we have a relationship. But if not, when things go bad, and we see this a lot, is like, no one knows you. And which only makes it easier for you to fall into temptation.
Yeah, shout out to Kevin Queen from a neighboring church. Yeah. But I was with Kevin and his team in March. I was just in Nashville. And, he said something that I never thought of in all these years in ministry is, it's usually new to Crosspoint or new to Way Church, right? Well, in a church plant, everybody's new. But, with an existing church, that's a really good strategy. But they started a new to Nashville gathering. Mm-hmm. He said, because there's so many people in, and I'm like, well, of course, because you don't know anybody, you don't know where it's going. I want to talk about community and younger leaders. So I have a small group I'm really excited about, all people at very similar stage. And like last night, we had dinner at our place. We've expanded our group from 2 hours to 3 hours. And I got to be the time cop. It's like, all right, some people have to get home. We got to keep going. And we were all laughing last night that we've all been part of groups or communities where it's like, all right, look at question 3. Who would like to read question 3, right? And then you're like, oh, can we do this? Can we do this in an hour? Like, we don't need it. And we're like, we would do 6 hours if we had time. And it's just, it's an amazing group. I'm so grateful. I'm sensing your generation doesn't have time for, would someone read question 3? And okay, can we get a different translation? I mean, I'm just talking about the awkwardness of small groups. Like whenever we get together, you guys cut to the chase fast. Is that just you, or do you think that's a hunger that you're seeing in the people around you as well?
That's a good question.
I think it's probably multi-generational. I think people like being asked good questions, for sure. Mm-hmm. I would love for you to share on just even this. I mean, this so resonates with us right now. I want to know, so are you guys meeting 6 to 9 or when
No, we're meeting 4 to 7. It's really complicated. One couple comes in an hour and a half. We're all super busy. We're all on airplanes. Like one of the couples missed it last night. They were in Italy. Next time we have Canadian Thanksgiving. And then, one's a medical doctor who was on a fellowship in Boston, but it went to virtual so he could make it. So like literally pulling all of us together has been almost impossible, and we almost gave up. And then we came up with 4 to 7. And we knew 2 hours, but when we met last year, it was like 5 hours. And we're like, okay, this is not sustainable. Like we all have lives and everything. But there's such a hunger for authentic community. It's just 4 couples. And, it's been so life-giving. And so, it's 3 hours. We gather, we check in for an hour. We have a quick dinner. They're all good cooks. So we were doing gourmet stuff. It's like, all right, stop trying to wow people. We literally ordered pizza. We brought in boxes of pizza, and that's what we served last night. And we ate outside, and then we had about an hour discussion around what lie is at the center of your life. Like, what lie do you believe that isn't true? And stuff popped.
Dude.
Like,
yes,
man, that's
it was
so good.
great.
that you guys started like that too is I just want to say this, and I'll let Cheyanne share our what we're doing. And it sounds like God might be doing something for leaders like this. Is there's a quote for connection and that core memory thing, and that I use a lot. It's such a random quote for it, but Abraham Lincoln has this quote where there's somewhere he says something like, "If I had 6 hours to cut down a tree, I would use 4 of those hours sharpening my axe." And when I think about, hey, if I get these people for 6 hours, if you will, or for 2 hours, but I'm gonna use 60% of that time to build a bond and connection, so I could use the last couple percentage so they can actually have meaningful conversation that's actually gonna matter. And the fact that you guys, it's 2 hours in before you guys even start talking about things, but I bet that last hour is like, it's so easy, it's so real, it's so memorable, it's so powerful.
And I'm one of the group leaders. My wife and I lead it. Tony and I lead it. And, I'm like, all right, let's do a check-in and I'll go first. Like there's no veneer. There's no fake church face here. I had a really crappy day and I was upset about this and lacking margin. And I know I wrote a book on it, but and I went into a lot more detail than that. But I'm like, please don't bring your game face. Please bring your real face.
Yeah.
And
so
I think I'm hungering for that. How does that go with the next generation?
It's really good. It's interesting for us because we have what I would call close friends, and we also have close up friends. And so because of just how much we get to do nationwide with friends across the nation, we have a small group, also 4 couples. So maybe that's the magic number here.
I don't know.
But we have a small group of us who...
These guys, I'm a big, let's get some more people. They literally, we can't do more than 8. I'm like,
I'm like, no more than 8. I'm like a limited guy. I'm there. I'm with you, Cheyanne.
We had an intense discussion and
debate about, can we do 10? There's like, no, 8. It's just once it passes 8, it's anxiety. I'm like, how? It's 2 more people.
It depends what you want to accomplish.
The way the maths.
You end up, I read this once, but you can't believe everything.
Over 2 people.
Yeah, we're arguing about 2 people right now.
It matters.
But you know why I think it matters? If you have more than 8 people at a table, you end up with 2 conversations.
Yes.
I guess.
You ever think about that?
That's good.
You end up with 2 conversations because one end can't really hear the other. And then you just end up with 2 different groups. That's true in leadership for an elder board. I never had more than 5 elders when I was leading Connexus, because then you end up with factions. And if you have 5 really sharp people, you're okay. So I find generally 4 couples is the max where you can have 1 conversation. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's me.
And then if you have a couple that can't make it, 3 is still, 3 couples is still a good solid number. So thank you, Carey, for...
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So this podcast's over. Grant Cheyanne's right. Anyway, I'm just saying that's my preference. I'm not saying she's right. I'm just saying that's my preference.
It's a good point.
Yeah. But then if you want to do a party or spike baller, that's different. We've had lots of
then
people
invite some people in. Yeah, that's good.
But if you want intimacy, smaller, too small, it's weird, right?
Mm-hmm. True.
Yeah, there's something about 6 to 8 that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So we've got a group of 8 of us who every year we get together. We see each other all throughout the year, fortunately, because even though we all live in different states and different parts of the country, we're involved in a lot of similar things. And so we get together every New Year. We actually stole this idea from Andy Crouch. So shout out to our friend. But we get together every New Year and we aim to spend 3, if we can manage it, 4 full days all together. And there's a little bit of kind of an agenda, but it's really just time in person, playing games, resting, checking in, having side conversations, having group conversations, going and exploring whatever city we're kind of in. We try to pick a different city every time. And for us, that has brought such a level of just stability. People who, they are that pick up the phone and call them if something comes up, whether it's, hey, this just hit the fan. What's your insight? What's your perspective? Sometimes it's family stuff. Sometimes it's work stuff. Sometimes it's just, I'm trying to figure out this aspect of my health or whatever it is. It's just really great to have people who know you deeply. So I would say those are really close friends, but we also have close up friends. And I would say that's like our regular, we meet every week. Also for couples, small group here in Nashville. And they were friends who, when we moved to the city, we actually formed a small group before we officially joined a church.
There you go.
So we said, we're just going to handpick people. We want friends who are kind of in our life stage, who are, kind of wired similarly, but different. And we want different perspectives. We want different personalities, kind of speaking into our lives, but we need people who are close up also. And yeah, we go deep, but I would say just having people who understand what life in Nashville looks like, who are regularly just kind of checking in on the day-to-day, mundane, like what happened this week, and how's your heart towards your local church? We all attend different churches, and so that's always a fun conversation too. But close and close-up friends have been lifesavers in different ways for us.
One thing I'll add to that really stood out, especially when we first did this, was as newlyweds at that time, this was nearly a little less than 3 years ago, was I never accounted for this as a young single person, is how important couples are where both of you guys like both of them.
Yes.
Like,
so real.
I had a lot of friends where I was like, I love him, and she would even love him, but I was like, but I don't know if I really connect with her. And she had the same. Where I was like, he's a cool guy. He's a nice guy. I would start all saying the stuff that was like, yeah, good guy. It's like, but do you want to hang out with him? No, I don't want to. And so it was finding who is like, we just all click. And if you get 8 people who click across the board, it's just, there's a lot of magic that can happen there. Andy shared to some of our young leaders, and they kind of instigated a text group right there. But he actually called this group the Eulogist. They call themselves the Eulogist. Andy Crouch, where he said years ago he just formed kind of in light of all the leaders falling. He's like, let's get together regularly or once a year, and maybe throughout the year here and there. But we want to be so close to each other that we would be the ones doing each other's funeral, because we have that kind of depth of commitment to each other. And that inspired us several years ago. And that, when I said I'm outing myself, is like, I'm a big believer, and I don't know if it's bad. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's common. Is I think if you can, you should form your own small group. Now, don't make it so easy. It's just to hang out. But there's when you're new to town and you need a small group and they can help you. I just think there should be different nets. But if you can find a community where it's like, we already have some chemistry here. I think the challenge is not all of us go to the same church. In a kingdom mindset, I think that's fine. But I can get how you guys are at this church and this church and this church, and whose leadership is overseeing it. So I can see that getting difficult, I guess. But it's been the most life-giving small groups I've ever been in since we started doing that about 5 years ago, really.
I love the distinction between close and close up, because the problem is you may have your best friend who lives across the country. You see her or him twice a year, but you have nobody close up in your life who knows how it went on Tuesday at 3:00, right? So that's different. The other thing you said, Grant, I think there might be something there. I have always, usually, been very intentional about who's in my small group, in part because I want it to work. And if you're going to debrief and you're in leadership, you can't really unload that on like what function is your group serving. Yeah. And so I've been very careful to cultivate small groups where I always like to have somebody who's a little bit on the fence spiritually in the group. But I also want it to be a safe enough place relationally that if I'm having a bad day, I can say it and you don't have to keep some kind of veneer up or whatever. But I wonder if that's something that is unique to leaders, because I can also see if you're not in leadership and not plugged into the kingdom the way you are or the way I am, but it's just like, I love Jesus and I want to go to a church, or I'm curious about Jesus and want to go to a church, how that sort of big, this is how we connect people in groups thing could work. But as you get more established, maybe in leadership, if you really want to go deep, because trust proceeds at the level of the least trusting person in the room. So think about this. That's right good. Now, we're 45 minutes into this conversation. If we introduced a complete stranger that I don't know and you don't know, either of you know, in this conversation, we'd be right. It would be so weird. And we're right back to like, oh, what's your name? Okay, what are you doing here? We're having a really good chat right now about community and the future of the church, and got to recalibrate to zero. And I think leaders are lonely, and doesn't have to be. But I wonder if that's part of it, because without community, like I'm dead. I know for me personally. And I'm seeing that in the next gen. So when I think we had lunch, maybe it was in Dallas, Fort Worth. Was it then that we sat down and we came up with this idea of like this marriage retreat? And you were just so open and honest about where you were, where a lot of your friends were. And I hope you're talking to my wife about that soon. So I'm hoping that can happen in 2024. Talk about being married and next gen. What's the experience of a lot of young couples you know? What has that been like?
You want me to start or do you want to go? I can do it. I
Yeah,
can
jump in if you have
give some
thoughts.
and then you jump on. I know, we talked about it a lot because, like I said, things I didn't account for that I just didn't realize. I'd focused so much on being a leader that then I realized, man, there's a difference in marriage, even in leadership. And I think, Carey, remember, there's a couple of things I was telling you, and I would even say there's a difference in being a leader in the next generation of, because culture's kind of changed and the church has kind of changed a bit in how we see, even like, let's say women in leadership, that's also going to change how we respond to maybe the norms of what our parents or grandparents experience in marriage. And so some of the new, I don't want to call them challenges. I would just say they are things, realities we got to at least acknowledge and have a plan for is if you're getting married today, one, counseling is a big one. I felt like counseling was so recommended the year before getting married. It's like go into marriage strong with some counseling, premarital counseling.
Yeah.
Everyone recommended it. And I felt like counseling wasn't highly recommended to that degree until pre-divorce. So it was like pre-marriage or it's like, oh, you guys are on the brink of divorce? You're starting talking about divorce?
Funny.
No, okay, now you guys need to get counseling again. I was like, why didn't we do some like post-marriage counseling? Like how many people talk about how hard the first year is? I'm so shocked there's not equally as much like, hey, make sure that counselor also then walks with you just for the first year. Like even maybe budget for that just as much as you budget for the wedding. Maybe more importantly is budget for a counselor the first year of marriage. If everyone keeps saying that, that's one of the hardest years, then have a plan for that. But that's where that group in Nashville really helped a lot is almost of the 8, the original group, like I think almost everyone had been married in the last 2 years. And so we all, during COVID too, so like we all had mostly COVID weddings. And so it was very helpful. It was so helpful to talk to others that were navigating marriage in that time. The second thing I would say is it's not, at least a lot of my friends and the people we were talking about were maybe 2 individuals who had different types of callings, though they did life together, similar to you and Tony. It's like, hey, well, you both have books, and therefore you might both have travel schedules, and both might be speaking at 2 different major conferences at the same day, and just how to talk about that, let alone if you have kids or babies or babysitters. And it's just not as much, or I'm just seeing more, thank God. Like, I think it's a great thing is we're seeing where it was, hey, the wife is also going out. She's not just like, all right, you go and I'll be back here waiting on you. It was going out, or we have not seen as much and we're only going to see more where I think of like Jenny Allen and Zach Allen, who I remember talking to her and her husband around that time we were talking, Carey, and her husband's line has just always stuck with me of he was doing amazing. He was a church pastor. He was doing all this stuff and kind of stepped down a bit to help support Jenny. And the line he said is, I chose to become a dream releasing husband.
Yeah.
And I think of Hannah Barnett, who's one of the 8, and I know is a mutual friend of ours, amazing young female leader, and Aaron, her amazing husband, who's really got behind Gen D, her organization. And Cheyanne's doing some amazing things right now that it's finding out like how, okay, this is maybe these couple months is you and this couple months is us. And I know we don't have the answers. I just know, man, that's a new challenge that I don't think there's a lot of insight on how to navigate that. So those are 2 big ones is first year of counseling and navigating when you
dual
have 2
career.
callings.
Yeah,
and,
dual calling, dual career. Yeah, and that's been a factor. I think that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation in our marriage. I mean, my wife and I met in law school. She was also a pharmacist. So, I mean, when she worked, she made more money than I did for years in ministry. And it was really helpful to put bread on the table, with very small churches and the whole deal. And I had to learn very on, or, I don't know whether I had to learn it, but I saw very early on, it's like, we have 2 real legitimate callings here in this house. not just mine, and your job is to support me. And that might have been a little bit out there back in the day, but I'm really glad to see it in the next gen where, and I remember having conversations with Tony saying prayerfully, who should have the dominant career? Because we didn't think we could both go full guns 50, 60 hours a week, right? And stay married and stay happy and stay alive and all that. And prayerfully, she decided that, if you're called to ministry, I will play the support role. But that was a negotiated thing. It wasn't an assumption. And I mean, she's super sharp. One of my great joys this summer was she had an event. I wasn't busy. So I went and carried her bags and sat there in the front row cheering her on. That was great. That was fantastic. I had no role. It was the best.
It is cool,
So nice.
How do you see that, Cheyanne?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because so much of what we learn in life, right, is what we've seen people do before us. And we either are trying to emulate that or we're trying to do, something very different from that. Right. But regardless, we still kind of have this picture of what it could look like and how it kind of plays itself out, not just on paper, but like in, negotiating like, okay, who's picking up the kids today? Or, well, I've got this travel, you've got that travel. They've asked us to both be there. Which one, quote unquote, wins out? And I love what you highlighted there, Carey, because it really is. It's a for us. I think what we're figuring out now is it is a negotiation, and each opportunity is a new conversation. And I think early on, especially in marriage, there was just so many things that. It was like, I've been a Christian since I was 4 years old and I've known Jesus for a long time. So like, you're so lucky to get me, kind of like if I'm being completely honest, like there was a little bit of like pride built up in my mind. And then we get married and all this stuff starts coming out of me and I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that was there. And so I think it's been a gift. Truly, it's been a really hard gift to receive, but a pure and invaluable gift nonetheless of like some of the humility I think that just comes in marriage. And the more that you see the Lord doing in and through your spouse, the more you're just like, oh, this marriage, this whatever it is, this life, this schedule, this, winning, whatever it is, like this isn't actually about me. Like I wonder, like what could Jesus be wanting to do in the life of my spouse? Like I have a mentor, Dr. Alicia Britt Jolie, who we just love and adore. She just opens her mouth and I swear wisdom just falls out of it. Like she's just so wise and so kind and so close to Jesus. And she asked us one time, she's like, I just wonder if each of you spent maybe 5 minutes asking Jesus what the conversation in heaven over your spouse is right now. And I just kind of, okay. That was a really great thought. And I think it's just trying to lean more into that, leaning more into what does life look like together, but also understanding like the verse around two becoming one is true. And I think can, outside of, appropriate kind of context and whatnot, can be misleading because all of a sudden it's like, well, if my life is my spouse's life, then like, why did God make me unique? And where does my calling fit in that? And so the way I've kind of begun thinking about it, for better or worse, is you have your calling, I have my calling, and then we share one. And what does that look like? Like what kind of nuance does that create in the conversation? And how do we make room for all three of these, knowing that there's going to be overlap, knowing that there's going to be seasons where it's like, okay, it's not going to be an equal 50-50 all the time. Like that's not always realistic. That's not part of this dance that we're in life. Like we talked about dancing in terms of juggling, margin in our life and all the things that are just, that come with different seasons. But I think figuring that out when you're both kind of unique leaders in your own rights in marriage is really important too, is what does the dance look like? And it definitely requires a deep level of humility that I know I'm being humbled with. So,
yeah. Carey, I mean, if you share some wisdom on us, what is there anything y'all found as, when did Tony's book come out? It was
about 2 years
2021?
2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before you spoil. Yeah. Great book.
Is there any finding in the last 2 years that you're like, all right, this Because would that be where she started traveling pretty big in the last, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, she's doing quite a bit of traveling and everything. And I think because she was so thoughtful with me back when we first got married and kind of went through things, because I realized, wow, I've married somebody who's whip smart, smarter than me. And she was so deferential to me that it was easy for me to be supportive and deferential to her. And of course, she did practice law for a number of years, et cetera. And, not that I always get that right, but it was one of those things where I think if I was really honest, there's a part of me that says, oh, that's her thing. And I don't need to go. And then when she had an event in Dallas and I was actually off, it was my month off. And part of me is like, well, off means off. So I don't really want to do a work trip. But then I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to just be her companion and her support. Because often when she does have an event, like she was out last week on the West Coast, talking to a business leaders breakfast, I had stuff I had to do here. I had to do some podcast interviews. I had to do other stuff. So I legit couldn't go, and she totally understood that. But when I have the opportunity, it's not like, oh, that's her thing, go have fun. Like, she's come to support me so many times, I have to go out and support her. And so it's a reminder to me as a man to do that.
That's really good, Carey.
The other thing I love about your generation, there's so many different things, but I'm barely Gen X, almost a boomer. And so technically born in 65. So technically I'm Gen X. But I did not want to spend time with older leaders when I was young. And what I find in your generation, we have friends who are like 30, 20 years younger than us. And they really genuinely value the wisdom of older friends, older leaders. Why do you think that is in your generation? Because it's all over the place. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I think because there's so much foundational, historic areas of growth or learning that just, again, they are failing the next generation. So if you're not staying at a job for a long time or getting a boss that really is like, I'm committed to you being here for a long term and we're going to develop you. There's not, I used to in the early days when talking about millennials, they would always say, why do you think young people aren't as, why do you think they're not as loyal to their company as we used to be in our generation? And I started asking, do you think companies are as loyal to the employees as they used to be in your generation?
Fair.
It's just not the same system. If you're not, if you go to learn from teachers and professors, and then you end up graduating, so many friends work at Starbucks or work at a job. There's like, I can't believe I majored in this and I'm working in this. It's so interesting to me how many unbelieving young people are seeking and would totally be open to having mentors in their life. That's where I often think that the church has such an advantage is our founder's last words, which I think should be our first priority, is go and make disciples. Is like we that's our product. It's not, in my opinion, church services. It's disciples. We make disciples. And if we do that well, ironically, the world is looking for it a lot. And I kind of on this too, if I can ask you another question, Carey, because if there's one thing that you stand out for is the reverse of this to me, like I will write one day, and with your permission, I'll add a story with you in it, is I don't think there's, unfortunately, for how many young people want to learn from the older generation, I haven't found as much of a reverse of that, where it's like I'm older and I'm trying to figure out next gen, because so many are. It's got to be top 5 conversations in the church today is how do we reach the next generation, or why are they leaving? You, the first time I met you, were so curious about learning from me. And I've never told you this, but we spoke at an event, and then we both had a flight around the same time. It was in Atlanta, and we found out we were both going to the airport. So you're like, you want to just ride with me instead of catching an Uber? So of course I'm thinking I'm with you. I'm going to ask you so many questions, and I love asking questions. So, but you didn't let me ask almost any questions, like at all. I legit, a 30, 40-minute drive, you asked all the questions, and you were so sincerely curious and asking, what do you think on this and the next gen? And I'm seeing this, what's your perspective? I've only had like a handful, legit 5 or less people where I want to ask them because I so respect them, and they've so flipped it on me, and we're so curious, and I have such immense honor for that. But it made me think, even as a millennial at that time, now Gen Z over the last couple of years, of course, is so next gen. As it helps me think, man, I don't want to be the guy who's like, oh, you're the new next gen person. I'm challenged by you. It's more like, yo, okay, it's time for me to learn from you. I'm curious. Yeah, where did that come from for you?
Yeah, it wasn't really a decision. And I'm glad that was me on a good day, because otherwise I just would have, and I remember that a lot. But I hope that's my posture with the next generation, with people I meet. It is a conviction. I came out of my summer vacation this year kind of going, I want to be less of a teacher, more of a student. But I also have a profound understanding of the passage of time. I have a degree in history. I'm reading history right now. And you just realize that, you were the young leader, now you're not the young leader, moving into sort of the sage years or whatever you want to call them. And so many of my assumptions from songs, movie references, the next generation doesn't even get. And I didn't grow up as a digital native. You did, and everybody younger than you did. And so I think if I want to keep leading with relevance and intelligence into the next generation, I just have so much to learn and so much I don't know. And yeah, I can offer a little bit of wisdom here or a little bit of help there. But I really think it comes from a posture of realizing my limits. And some of that is a limited perspective too. That's true of race. That's true socioeconomically.
Yeah,
that's true culturally. And so I really want to be a student as I get older. And I find like cynicism and knowledge are very closely related. So the more you know, the more cynical you become.
Yeah.
And a lot of people my age get very cynical very fast. And then they get upset because the next generation's not coming to me to ask me questions. And, I have all this wisdom. It's like, well, maybe if you'd be a student and build a relationship with them, people would take an interest in you.
Wow.
That might happen. So I don't know. All that is going on in my head as I think about that. But I think you're right. The natural posture is to go, well, I'm the expert now, so you're lucky to have some time with me. But I just want to be a student of life and really curious, and I love younger leaders. Like, you bring in energy and vitality to things. I think I'm pretty energetic for my stage, but like, you guys bring energy and ideas and perspectives. And here's a pet peeve of mine. You asked me pet peeves.
Yeah.
My pet peeve is when I was 23, people gave me a stupid amount of responsibility. When I was 30, they entrusted me with a church. Like, they gave me ridiculous amounts of authority and responsibility. And I think my generation and older, we kind of look at you if you're under 40 and go, oh, they're still kids. Like, Do you find that we're holding on to the keys a little bit too long?
It's a good question. So as you know, Carey, I work for a tech company that's incredible. It's based out of Boulder, Colorado. Serves the church, but it's not a ministry or a church itself. And in my experience there, I've been given so much more trust and responsibility than I had earned. And I think it's really interesting knowing it's at a kind of tech company, very forward thinking, very futuristic. Like, how do we help create a system that supports the church and the church can really come together around this? So it's constantly kind of asking these big questions. And I will say to kind of juxtaposition my experience there versus in church. I've been given responsibilities to lead teams and to inform product decisions and to make design choices and user experience things. Like, my degree is in psychology, sociology, and counseling. And I
think we can name it. I mean, Glue is no stranger to this podcast, and Scott
They're
Beck
fantastic.
and Brad Hill. They're amazing. And, I hadn't really thought about it, but it is a young team.
Yeah.
And Scott, with all of his genius, scaling Blockbuster and lots of other national chains and everything like that, probably understands that intuitively. But in the church, that's not always everyone's experience.
That's right. Yeah. And I think there can be so much partnership and collaboration. And I love that you're focusing on just taking a learner's posture in that. I would say that has not, been my experience leaning in with churches or ministries necessarily. Has been that kind of same posture. It is. I would challenge us. I would encourage us to really focus on, kind of the abundance mentality versus any sort of scarcity mentality, whether that's around power, position, or influence, whatever that may be, or even just disconnection. I think there can be, we talked earlier about expectations. There can be some assumptions and some expectations that may or may not even be real in our, kind of local context as we're trying to figure out how to navigate things. That I would say I've had a really great experience work-wise with, even though I'm under 40, I just turned 30 this past year. And so
everything's going to change.
Everything's going to change. So
I guess 10 more years, what you're saying potentially.
Yeah. So even leading up to all that, I was given immense trust. And somebody believed in me when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. And that's how it should be. I mean, people were changing the world as teenagers in history.
Yeah.
If you look at it, John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, had mastered Greek and Latin, I think, by the age of 3. It's crazy. And we're lucky you were teaching alphabet. I'm not saying you should teach your kids Greek and Latin, but I'm just saying if you compare yourself to a couple hundred years ago, people were entrusted with so much at a very young age. What do you think about that, Grant? Like, do you feel that the next generation is empowered enough, or we've got room to grow in that as church leaders?
Yeah, I think it's a huge conversation. I've never really got to talk to you about it, or I really haven't many older leaders kind of bring it up. But I do think this is a bigger problem than we realize. It is that we are slower to hand over the baton in the church space. And I really even thinking through it and hearing her talk about glue in the tech world, it might even be in this specific industry, because I think of DC, and it's such a young empowerment space. I think of movies, especially music. It's a young, I remember hearing Kanye West interviewed once. He's like, they were asking, why are you moving to fashion? Because at the time he wasn't successful yet. It was really crazy. He was you're so good at this, why would you go to fashion? And Sway was asking him this, and he's like, it's a young man's game. He's like, it's a young man's game, is what he kept saying. It's like, tell me one artist that's over 50 who's breakout artist of the year. And I had never thought of that. He's like, tell me anyone who is older. He's like, it's always someone new. You got to be thinking ahead of what's next. And I wonder how much that is kind of hurting the church to be like, I do think there's a correlation to us always asking questions about the next gen. And then you look at conferences today and you're like, there's no next gen voices.
I know.
We're not raising
about that. In events I plan, I'm like, okay, diversity, but age diversity too. Yeah. It's like, well, what are these people doing? It's like, okay, all right, let's not talk that way. No, I hear you. And music is young. Influencers are young. And incredible. There's this band I follow on TikTok, Burn the Jukebox. I mean, these guys are just, I don't know whether you found them, but they're amazing. They've got to be teenagers. And they're just so musically gifted and fluid. And we have certain roles for them, but it's sort of like when you get into the upward leadership echelon, it's like, well, you're just lucky to have a seat at the table, not a voice, just a seat. I don't know. That's not good.
Yeah. When I was 24, I used to always say this line. I said something like, and it's been a long time. And I said, if you were to join the military at 18 years old, they would entrust you in another country with a lethal weapon, or maybe even a tank or a jet. If you were to join a nonprofit in another country, they might they didn't trust you with like the entire like youth program, or maybe the whole dang thing over there. But if you were to join a church at 18 or 19 years old, they'll be like, do you want to be either on the parking team or on the
we'll entrust you with a traffic cone.
It's like on this one day for a couple hours. And I always say the next generation is not leaving because they're not leaving because they've been asked to. Sorry, Carey.
Go.
I know. I just always feel like the next generation, they're not leaving because they get asked to do too much, but because they're getting asked to do too little.
You're right. Yeah. You're right. Inside joke. But anyway, okay, let's talk about the discipleship crisis, because a lot of people think, well, we have Bible studies, we have small groups. I teach expository teaching. That's not what you're talking about. What are you talking about?
You talking about with discipleship?
Yeah. If it's not just Bible studies or, because most churches would say, I think we're checking the box on that. But I think you can also look at how politicized and tribalized the church got, not only in the mid-2010s with elections, but the way we kind of imploded with COVID. It's like, oh, we have a discipleship problem. I agree with that.
Yeah.
And the answer maybe isn't more Bible studies. What is it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think one, you got to start with building a culture of discipleship where it's not just something the staff needs to take on. I'm the last person that wants to say, hey, one more thing that church staff need to do to like fix everything. I think that the people, the congregation, us as the body, the church, need to step up. What it means to be a Christian is to be a disciple, not just a believer. Right now, I think like the scorecard often is go to church regularly, give to the church, join a small group, and maybe serve. Those four things, and every single one of those are very important. Have a role. I want to add to the scorecard, not take anything away. I kind of liken it to a pulse. You need to have a pulse. Those things are all things of a pulse. But you can have a pulse and be eating really unhealthy. And so there's some other parts of the scorecard that it's like, but are you pouring into someone? Does someone know who you are? Like, and that you, sorry, not does someone know who you are, but like, could you go and ask some of your friends, like, hey, do you have someone that you are pouring into? Because I'd love for Christians to be marked by, like, those are the people that just pour into the next gen. Like, they are really good at raising them up. They're really good at pouring into them. They're just, I always want to hire a young Christian because they're just really hard workers. They ask questions. They have relationships with older people. They know how to interact with older people. They're not always on their phones. They take notes. They just all these different marks of young people, because it's just so in the ethos of Christians is we are the people that pour into the next gen and elevate their character, their calling, their maturity. And I would just quickly say how this isn't kind of happening right now is if you were to I always say this test is like, if you were to take, let's say, 50 people from your church, put them in 50 different rooms, and some of those 50 are the church staff, some of those 50 are the elders or deacons or elder leadership, some of those are key volunteers, and some of those are just part of the congregation, but they're all involved in some form or fashion. And you ask them, what is the discipleship strategy at our church? It's pretty surprising how many people would have so many different answers. And what's even more surprising is I think there's a lot of churches that have the mission statement on their walls is something like, we exist to glorify God by making disciples in Dallas or Nashville or Denver or whatever. But it's literally making disciples. That's the thing we're doing. But you ask them, well, how are we doing it? What's the strategy to do it? And there's not a clarity on that. And so my issue as a young leader who was always asking, like, hey, what's the discipleship strategy here? No, 9 out of 10, they may not have an answer. And if they did, they would say, oh, well, we got small groups for that. But then I would then say the second question is then what's the success rate of discipleship relationships through small groups? And there was usually no even info on that, or even there's no metric at all. So that's the second part is like build a culture within the church, and the second part I think is build a measurement so we know it. And it doesn't have to be we all as the Christendom have the same metric, but your people are clear on what your metric is for discipleship. Because I promise once you measure it, it's gonna show that it matters and they're gonna move towards it. But right now, the word that's most associated with discipleship in my experience is the word organic. It's usually, if I would ask, they'd say, oh, well, we have more of an organic strategy. We're doing small groups. And I'm like, yo, hipsters, millennials, we are the ones that created the organic thing. I'm telling you, organic is the opposite of what you want associated with discipleship. Organic means like these fruits have not been touched. They have not been tampered with. They have not been altered. They are organic. And that's not the disciples' story. If you look at Jesus and the disciples, they definitely were tampered with. They definitely were altered. They were impacted. The trajectory of their life was changed because of intervention. And so I don't think you can do organic discipleship. I don't know why we do organic discipleship when Jesus did such strategic discipleship. And so just quickly, I'll say, Carey, is everything else in the Great Commission is strategic. Jesus called us to like 4 things: to go, to make disciples, to teach, and to baptize. Those are the 4 calls to action. And every other one we do strategically. We don't do organic missions. We don't just send our people and say, just figure out what to do. There's literally books about that. When helping hurts is when you do just organic missions. You work with vetted partners that know what they're doing, that are indigenous to that area, that know what the actual need is, and then you help. No one I know, and no matter what denomination, even the ones that are like very free spirit, they do not do organic preaching on Sunday. They're not like, who's feeling it this Sunday? No, they have strategic meetings to plan the whole year. That's strategic plans for and preparation for the sermons, and they're going to teach strategically. And same thing with go teach, as well as baptism. Like we don't just expect our people to organically go get baptized in the lakes or rivers or jacuzzis. Like we have classes, we have weekends dedicated to it. We have like plans to make sure they know what they're doing. And so I always think like, man, why would we do that? One left is the discipleship piece. Is we're still doing that organically when we do everything else strategically, but Jesus clearly did it strategically. And that's why I keep going back to this next gen thing. Is the next gen is the one who are suffering when we take that organically. Because if we don't disciple them, the world would love to, and is and has been. The only difference is, and why I think we keep thinking something's changing in the next gen, is because the world has changed a lot in the last 20 to 30 or 40 years. They don't look as close to the church as they used to. They look way further. And so now this generation is way further because they've been discipling them. And now we're seeing the cost of not discipling the next generation.
Have you seen a church or an organization offer that kind of strategy you're talking about, or you have in mind, or that's what you're going to have to write?
That's why we're doing a church plant when we have a lot of other things we are doing, honestly, is because of that question is, it's probably the number one question I've been asked, Carey, is like, what other churches are doing it? And I always want to shout out certain churches that like, I think that Manna Church in North Carolina, Hatcher is the last name. He's on a military base, and I know he wrote a great book. I think it's called Empowering Leadership, where he was forced to focus on discipleship because being in a big city with a military base, or one of the biggest military bases, he was always losing members. And so he's like, I got to train up a culture of discipleship and empowerment because I'm going to lose my people. I think, Carey, it's why so many campus ministries, not even just college ministries specifically, almost all college campus ministries, the ones that are on campus, really have a tendency to focus on discipleship because they're not going in with the mentality that we're keeping these people. They know from the offset we're losing them. I would say Jesus knew from the offset, I'm losing them. So when you know that, you're like, how do I equip them and prepare them as much as possible so I can send them, rather than this idea of how do I just get them to keep coming back and invite their friends?
So Manna Church, college ministries, anyone else, anywhere else you would point people to? Way Church.
Way Church. Yeah. I mean, that's the one is like,
that's good.
We
Those are three
want
examples.
to, in Nashville, prioritize measuring discipleship, forming a culture of discipleship. And if I could just, like, because I know it's a little bit of a harder word, I failed at doing this. And I remember having to get my staff, and I would recommend this to any staff, is there's not a lack of pastors that want to make disciples. Everyone cares about it. I think Pete Scazzaro has this unbelievably great like framework for what he calls the action and behavior gap, which I think you could apply to almost
reading
everything.
Through that right now again. Yeah.
And when he saw that, I was like, man, this needs to be applied to so many of the principles of what we're called to do, because we all esteem to or value discipleship. It's just moving from I value it to like I prioritize it. He uses it for Sabbath, which is a perfect place. We're so like no one dislikes the Sabbath. No one thinks we shouldn't do the Sabbath. It's just many of us, including myself, it's moving from like I value it to I'm prioritizing it no matter what. And that's the next step, I think, for the American church, at least. And for us in the staff, it was kind of, hey, I'm going to put everyone on staff's name on the board in the main meeting room, and I want to start in the next 6 months figuring out who are you discipling and who's discipling you. I know you can't force discipleship. You can't force someone to say yes to disciple you, and you can't even force someone to say yes to you pouring into them. And it's awkward sometimes and hard to ask. There's probably one of the big reasons we don't do it. Like there's almost nothing like asking someone to disciple you or to be discipled other than asking someone to date you. It's kind of got a weird, awkward,
it's a pretty vulnerable question. And you're right, most people couldn't answer it.
Yeah, you're putting yourself out there and you could be rejected. There's not a lot of things you do. I mean, other than maybe somewhat like sharing the gospel, but at least this one's more like, do you choose me? Not do you choose Jesus? Like, do you choose me? Am I worth it to you? And so I think it's hard. And that's why I was like, let's give 6 months. And I just want to know, everyone has at least asked upward and downward. You've asked someone if you could to be discipled. And I found if giving a goal and giving a deadline and making it visual and making it a part of like something we so celebrate, people started making moves towards it and it started becoming a part of the culture. So then we can start talking about it and failing forward in it, because there's always something else that's on the calendar that's more important in urgent, at least, than discipleship. That it's got to be a consistent thing we see and talk about.
Cheyanne, we've talked a lot about discipleship. Anything you would add? And otherwise, I got another question for you.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of maybe just practical insights. This is something I think Grant lived for a long time, and then just through, joining lives, I've definitely reaped the benefit of is like, how do we live out discipleship? It's like you're preaching a lot about this thing, but what does that actually look like? And for us, it looks like giving somebody access to our calendar and saying, what would you like to join? That's what are you wanting to be discipled in? Like I'm discipling a young woman here in Nashville, and she wants to learn how to be a communicator. She also wants to learn how to be a healthy leader. She's trying to figure out her purpose right now. She feels called to ministry, but doesn't know exactly what that looks like. And so just we had a really upfront conversation about what is it you want to grow in? Do you see that in me? It's okay if you don't. If you do, then like, let's talk about it. I'd love to disciple you in that. If not, I would love to help connect you with somebody who I think could really pour into you in that area. So I think being specific, calling out also a time length to the relationship, I think is really helpful. I think that might be actually something, so we were talking about the church and discipleship. It was interesting hearing that the groups that know that they only have a certain amount of time, the military base and college universities, they know they only have 4 years on average, that they're really intentional. So I do think there's something about knowing like, oh, we're in a 1-year-long discipleship relationship. At the end of that 1 year, here's where you hope to have like grown. And I think just adding that level of clarity and intentionality goes above and beyond, because then when we're having conversations and we try really hard to, I'm sure you're familiar with this, this concept of habit stacking.
Yep.
We really want to habit stack. It's like, I would love to meet you for coffee if I'm really wanting coffee, but otherwise like, let's go for like, I'm trying to get really into walking out in nature. That's something that's really healthy for me. Why don't you come join that? Because I already have that on my calendar. Or, I'm doing movie night with my niece and nephew who live with us right now. Like, why don't you come join us for the movie night? And, we'll hang out for a little bit once they've gone to bed, but not looking to add more things to your calendar, but just adding somebody to your calendar, giving them permission, being willing to honestly be vulnerable enough to let somebody see past the veneer, past that, like, oh, I can show up and meet you at a coffee shop, but it's something different to let you in my home when I've not cleaned in 2 weeks and laundry's everywhere and the kids have painted the side of the house and whatever else. So those are just a few maybe practical examples. By no means I would think we would say that's like what you have to do, but just if it's helpful, a few ideas of what discipleship in the sense of how we kind of talk and think about it could look like.
Okay, so here's where I want to wrap up. I want you to think 5-10 years in the future. I mean, the oldest millennials turned 42, I think, this year. So we're not talking about kids anymore. But I want you to look 5-10 years in the future and think through the future church. How do you think when your generation really is fully shaping it, how ideally is it going to look? What's it going to look like?
So this is the dream church, right? Or is it like based on what we're seeing now?
Oh, you can play both scenarios. You can play both scenarios, but I'm talking
positive. I like
I
positive.
mean, it's probably not going to be generic. We're doing what everybody else is doing. Let's just get people in the room. I know that the jig's up on that. So what do you think? How are you going to shape it ideally? And then maybe, okay, what's a realistic scenario? Sure. That's a fun question.
Yeah. I think something that I dropped the ball in the discipleship conversation is realizing all these different elements of it that I'm excited that the Gen Z and maybe the youngest millennials I think are going to add to the conversation is that when I grew up in, let's say in my early 20s, I felt like discipleship, if you said that, generally people thought of it as let's go through a book together. And I would say it was kind of thinking memorization. It's like, hey, we could memorize the Bible together or this book together. And so the ending or the timeline was, let's finish a book. And once I finish the book, you've been discipled. And I just felt like it was lacking a little bit. So I was thinking, man, I'm not really thinking memorization. I'm probably thinking more like replication. I want to, like Jesus did. He trained them so much and impacted them so much that they could go and do what he did. He would even say they will do greater things, and in a way they reached more. But Carey, this is only like the last couple of years, I realized in light of seeing this shift towards more vulnerability and open conversations around emotional health and the clear need of emotional health and accountability and vulnerability in community from seeing so many leaders fall. We're seeing so many different leaders from Jeff Bethke, John Mark Comer, even, I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff Vanderstelt. I grew up with him as like a missional guy, and he was like, Grant, actually, I'm really moving. Not that I'm leaving missions. Emotional health is the thing. I'm like, man, everyone's like shifting over to this as the conversation. Of course, we talked about Pete Scazzero, Alicia, Britt Jolie. It's the message that's definitely resonating, especially with young leadership, that I always think, okay, memorization is important because I want the next generation not just to know how to lead, but to know and be anchored in the Word of God. So it's kind of, to me, a threefold piece that I would want to see in the future churches. They know God's Word and they memorized it, and it's in them, absorbed. 2, they replicate it. So they not just know God, they're making an impact for his name, and they know how to because they shadowed and saw it done well. And so they're doing it with excellence and winsomely. But then 3rd, they're healthy and they last and they finish well and they hear from God, well done, good and faithful servant. And they know how to connect with their children, their spouse, their people in general. They have the emotional health to do that. And so it's transformation, that inner transformation, I would say, leadership replication, as well as biblical memorization. The second part is, this might be an odd one, but I really think, man, we got to talk about more. And a conversation has been had. I just don't think it's been tied with next gen. And I am excited for how few young people even know much about the sacred and secular divide in Gen Z. And I'm thinking that's a silver lining, is they don't need to unlearn it. They never learned it as much, as well as I'm so thankful for how many young people are tired of church being just an event. And so they want something more, and that's a good thing. It's like, I think in the coming years we'll capitalize on, okay, this latent energy there's not a lot of young people that are leaving because they're lazy. They're leaving and joining social entrepreneur organizations. They have tons of side hustles. Statistically, like, so many of them are building something, creating content online. They're definitely creative and passionate, and there's this energy. It's just not going into kingdom efforts. And so what I think the future church will be is like, we are going to have a more robust form of success, of what church success looks like, to where it's in the world. It's one of the big conversations we're trying to think through in culture of way church is, yes, discipleship, yes, community, and 3rd is, how do we hinge the success of our church on the success of our people in the city, in their work, and in their faithfulness. Right. Like, some of my thinking of layers of that is, are they a faithful witness? Of course. Are they excellent and respected in the industry that they're in or the job that they're in? Do they bring like health and stuff to that? Or if they leave the job, is it just like anyone else? Or like, are people glad when they leave? Or they're like, man, we got to hire 2 people because of losing this person. Like, we didn't even realize how much that person was doing. They're so good at what they do. They bring so much to the culture. We miss this person. Like, the hospitality, the intentionality, that we're such a faithful witness, a gospel witness, and we're really good at what we do. I think like the hero, even in videos in churches today, again, it's usually, hey, this is John. John used to drink a lot, got saved, and now John's on the parking team. And basically it's like, be like John. And I mean, be like John, because we need parking team. Absolutely need parking team. I'm not negating that. I just think, and maybe we need other forms of heroes in the faith too, because it's either like that or it's a missionary overseas. There's a big gap of people that are in between that aren't going to be maybe one of those two, where it's a lawyer or a doctor or someone who cannot commit to that kind of weekly, but they can do something else, or they are doing amazing things for the kingdom, but they're not really getting highlighted. And I think the more we can highlight Christians in culture, and see them as a representation of our church in the city, the more we're going to reach the next gen where they're like, wow, I've never got this kind of support from my church for just doing my job. But now I'm learning how to do it more faithfully, with more excellence and with more intentionality.
Yeah. Yeah. For us, something that's been really helpful frameworks to think about this and have strategic conversations with young leaders is fivefold. So APEST, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. Just what are the gifts, being like who we are, who God created us to be. How do we steward ourselves as gifts to the world? Not in like a high and mighty way, but just in a stewardship kind of role. As well as the 7 channels or 7 mountains. There's a few different names of it. It's like, but what are the kind of influential main spheres in our everyday society? And so then you begin to kind of see this overlay of, okay, where do I find myself vocationally? Where am I spending the majority of my just hours, especially, weekday hours? And then how has God wired me? Like what is my particular kind of expression of Christ? As it just very naturally kind of flows out of me. It's just part of how God knitted me together. And so, for example, like I'm a shepherd heart working at a tech company. And so, working at Glue and working with engineers and working with brilliant people. Like I get to work really closely with our friends at Barnett, who are just incredible humans and also some of the smartest people I know. And so it's like, what does it look like to engage missionally at that specific intersection? Because that's where God's put me right now. And so how do I, as someone who has kind of a shepherd heart, show up in a technology, digital kind of partnership space? Yeah. And what does that look like? Well, for me, it looks like checking in on the people I meet with regularly. It's like not kicking off every single meeting with, okay, here's the to-do list, here's the agenda. It's taking, 6-7 minutes to just be like, hey, how's everybody going? Like, I know you were doing this and that this weekend. It's just the intentionality. And that might look super different for someone who has more of kind of an apostolic or almost like an entrepreneurial bent. Like that's going to look really different, even if you're in the same space or if you're in a different space with a similar wiring. And I think that just begins to underline and bring to light purpose, which innately, I think we were all designed with this desire to want to make an impact in the world. It's like, why was I created? Like, what is my purpose? And that can be a really interesting kind of framework to play with, to begin to kind of narrow in and have some really good conversations with people who know you, who love you, who know and love Jesus around what that could look like.
Well, I'll tell you, this has been absolutely fascinating. Final thought. I said that was final question. Now the final. And then we should wrap up. I'll go to Grant for one and you, Cheyanne, for the other. Grant, one piece of advice to leaders over the age of 40 when it comes to empowering the next generation. Make this like a bumper sticker, a soundbite, like just real quick.
You're saying 1 minute or 1 sentence?
1 sentence, 1 minute. I mean, you pick. Advice
I can do it in a minute. I will say.
Okay, you do it in a minute.
Look at Saul, and he did an amazing job until he got back to Jerusalem. He allowed a young leader that didn't have the credentials, but seemed like he had the hand of God to empower him to do one of the biggest things ever. Like I said, they don't leave because they're getting asked to do too much, but too little. And David, man, that was a huge responsibility. And we often don't want them to do big things because if they fail big time, which they will, then sometimes, then it'll really hurt us. But man, if you give them such a big responsibility, I think David never forsakes Saul, because we all remember the first individuals who were older who just believed in us and gambled on us. And it's a connection for life almost to that person. And so there's such power in that. Two, Saul did not force him to do it his own way. He's not like, hey, you're fighting Goliath. You should wear armor. You should take a sword. And I think we're in a time right now where we see Goliath or the culture taunting us and saying, oh, church is dying for decades. We keep hearing this, and I think it's time for a new way, not a new gospel at all, but a new approach. And letting a young leader or young leadership come and say, hey, I think we should try it this way. And it might end up being like, we're shocked it works. But third, is when we come back, it doesn't matter if they get a lot of credit. We need to learn how to like share the credit. He still got thousands. And today it would be like, well, David got 10,000 followers and you only got 1,000 followers. Who cares? Like God is going to win. Like God is going to win. There's more than enough lost people in the next generation for us all to just give it all for him and share. We don't care who gets the credit. We really are doing this for the kingdom.
Cheyanne, what would you say for under 40 leaders? So your generation, you got to give them a piece of advice. What are you telling them?
Yeah, I would say a similar sentiment, actually. Stay humble, embrace humility, and stay hungry. And those two things don't have to conflict or compete with one another. A book that is just radically kind of shaping my heart and mind right now is Humility and Absolute Surrender by Andrew Murray. And the more I read into it, the more it's just the Holy Spirit's revealing in my own heart. It's just my own lack of humility. And I think that can be such an easy place for those of us who are younger to get tripped up, is to think that because I've got the digital savvy, because I've got, opportunities here and opportunities there, I'm a gift in this way, and I've got these sorts of, strengths and leadership criteria, personality, whatever it may be. Like we can begin to think a little too highly of ourselves a little too easily. There's a reason why pride was the thing that got us in trouble in the first place.
That's true of all of us, I think, Cheyanne.
Yeah. So I think embracing humility goes a long way.
Great. I've so appreciated this conversation. People are going to want to track with you. So easy places to find you both online.
Luckily,
he's easier to find.
I think that's all.
I already outed myself earlier. I was like, I'm not great at social media, but it's fine. I'm there.
Yeah. Well, luckily, I've never seen the last name Skeldon before with a D. And so Grant Skeldon and Cheyanne Skeldon at, I think we both have our own websites now, Grant Skeldon and CheyanneSkeldon.com. And then also, if you ever want to hang with us, we are doing the Next Gen Summit at nextgensummit.com here in November.
Cool. Thank you both so very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a ton, Carey.
Yeah,
Great to hang.
Appreciate you.